under computer conditions. And it turns out that the intermediate steps that have been predicted by evolutionary biologists are exactly what a computer simulation will give you if you don't give the program any prior knowledge of where you want to go end up at the end. That's pretty interesting indirect evidence that the eye evolved that way. The other evidence, which is more direct, you can actually look at many of the intermediate steps, because many of the organisms living today still have the intermediate steps. You can find a bunch of gradations of complexity in the eye. It's not that every organism on Earth has a complex eye.
Okay, you misquoted me twice last time. I never said there were 10,000 species on the ark. Get it right this time. I said there are 10,000 kinds. Kinds. Very, very important distinction, okay? And I never said nobody has ever observed a new species. I never said that. Nobody's ever observed a new kind. You got it? Good. Okay. Now, let's go to the eyeball here. Charles Darwin said, "To suppose that the eye could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd." This textbook says the complex structure of the human eye may be the product of millions of years of evolution. This one says, I'll blow it up for you a little bit here, you can better understand how the eye might have evolved if you picture a series of changes during the evolution of the eye. This is exactly what he said a moment ago. You have to picture it. You have to imagine it. It doesn't take place in reality. You have to imagine how it happened. Imagine an animal with a spot that is sensitive to light. That gives him an advantageous, an advantage over those that don't have this spot, and therefore he's going to survive and the rest are going to be killed. See, evolution is based on death. One animal evolves a little better than the rest have to die in order for that one with the spot to take over the population. Evolution is based on the idea that death is wonderful, death is good, death's how we get ahead, the bad ones have to die.
Thank you.
That is exactly the opposite of creation. The Bible says God formed the eye. That's the way it happened.
Next question's for you. Dr. Hovind's argument would be nullified if it could be conclusively proven that God does not exist. Please address the existence of God from a purely scientific perspective.
Address the existence of God from a scientific perspective. Here we have an example of somebody defining the argument, and by the definition of their terms for science, of course, see, they say science has to be observable, testable, demonstrable, and that's going to automatically exclude God. Well, if that's your, they've set up the parameters where it's a no-win situation for the creationist. I think that we have the same situation for those who teach evolution. They believe in the existence of all sorts of things. They believe there are beneficial mutations, though nobody's ever proven one. They believe an animal can produce a different kind of animal, though nobody's ever observed one. It's not part of science. I cannot scientifically prove the existence of God. I can tell you he changed my life a whole lot 31 years ago. Anybody else in that boat? Yeah. There's my evidence right there. Changed lives. He can make the prostitute pure, make the drunkard sober, and make the liar quit lying. He can do amazing things.
I would like to remind Mr. Alvin that this is a scientific debate. We're not in a church. If we want to do something like this in a church, that'd be fine. What was the original question?
Dr. Hovind's argument.
Time for me.
Dr. Hovind's argument would be nullified if it could be conclusively proven that God does not exist. Please address the existence of God from a purely scientific perspective.
Right. Well, as I said, the existence of God, I mean, so on this one, Mr. Allen is definitely correct. The existence of God is not a scientific question, not because that doesn't mean that science excludes, I mean, the interpretation is science excludes anything that it cannot analyze. That's a fallacy, and that's a fallacy that plays in his field, but it's completely untrue, and I don't see why he insists in making it. The fact that something cannot be analyzed scientifically doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Okay? Our science, as far as I know, cannot analyze why certain people are so fond of the Three Stooges. Does that mean that there are no people out there that are fond of the Three Stooges? Of course not. Science cannot tell me, at this point at least, why is it that I'm so fond of Monty Python. But then, nevertheless, that doesn't negate that fact. So the fact that there are things that are outside of science, it's not equivalent to say that those things don't exist. On the other hand, I will call again on Hume's dictum. You're making a very extraordinary claim, so where's the evidence? Not scientific, but what kind of evidence do you have at all?
Can any known organism be traced back all the way to one cell?
Yeah, you were born that way. Whoever answered that question. The process of development is not well understood. That is one of the other things. There's a large number of academic journals on people working on developmental biology. Developmental biology is something that we know a lot about, but we know an awful lot. There is an awful lot that we don't know about. But nevertheless, you can observe the development of anything from one cell. In fact, everything develops from one cell. Now, in historical times, how would that happen? Well, I don't see what the problem is there. I mean, if you can see it under your nose over the span of a few hours or a span of a few weeks, I don't see what the problem would be over the spans of millions of years. All you need is, for example, a unicellular cell originally that has a mutation in one and duplicates that cell without then separating them. Now you have a multicellular organism, a two-cellular organism. Okay? If that gets inherited because of the mutation was heritable, then you now have multicellular organisms. It's not that simple. I'm simplifying the situation here, but I don't see any conceptual problem with that kind of thing. Incidentally, this duplication or addition of information, I did say that polyploidy duplicates information. Then mutations come in and they change that information, which means that when you add together the process of polyploidy, which is chromosomal duplication, plus mutations, you have actually created new information, contrary to what you just said.
Okay, you mentioned, read the question one more time so I get to phrase it right. I hate to keep doing this to you, but this is my point-by-point argument again. Let's go point by point next time.
I'm sorry, can any known organism be traced back all the way to one cell?
Can any known organism trace back all the way to one cell? If you mean as far as evidence that it evolved from a one-celled creature, absolutely not. What he gave was a far cry from an example of evolution. The human being starts off as one cell and becomes a man. That is because it's following a genetic code. If that's your example of evolution, you're either confused about what evolution is, or you're trying to, again, grossly oversimplify this process. Everything comes from one cell. That is because there's a code it's following, and there's an enormous intake of energy. To get my son from one cell to 22 years old and 6 foot tall took a huge amount of food. There was energy put into this thing. So that is not evolution. If you're teaching your students that that's an example, going from one cell to a fully grown human, that's an example of evolution, you're deceiving your students because it's following a complex genetic code and it is taking in information from the outside. That is not an example of evolution like taught in the textbooks. And by the way, where are the two-celled creatures in the world? It would have to go, there are millions, zillions of one-celled creatures. Where are the two-celled or the three-celled or the four-celled? They don't exist, folks, and he ought to know that. They don't exist. There are colonies that get together and do functions, Volvox and stuff like that, but that's a colony of cells. Each one is still an individual cell. That's not anything similar to a tissue or an organ, and there just aren't any. Evolution falls flat. And you talk about Hume's dictum. You're claiming that all life forms came from one cell. You better have some extraordinary evidence of that.
What about divinely inspired evolution?
What about what?
Divinely inspired evolution.
Divinely inspired evolution. I would say that would be a retarded God that has to use evolution. First place, there's no evidence for evolution anyway, so why should I compromise a perfectly good Bible which has never been proven wrong with a dumb theory which has never been proven right? I wouldn't want to make that trade-off. And plus, I would not worship a God that has to use suffering and misfits and death and blind chance and doesn't know what he wants. The God that I worship made it right first time. No mistakes.
You said